Get up! Move! Now! Toryn Draven barely had time to register the scream before the ground convulsed beneath him, tossing him into the shattered remains of an observation console. The sky was ablaze. Streaks of burning wreckage tumbled from the colony's upper defenses, their molten carcasses painting black scars against the choking clouds. Another impact. Closer this time. A thunderous detonation ripped through the southern perimeter, sending shards of superheated alloy shrieking through the streets. Screams echoed from the evacuation center, families trying to flee, caught in the indiscriminate slaughter. Toryn staggered upright, coughing against the dust clogging his lungs. His lab coat was in tatters, streaked with blood, his or someone else's, he couldn't tell. Plasma fire licked through the colony's skeleton, reducing entire blocks to slag. His earpiece crackled with static before Toryn Vay's voice broke through, frantic, breathless, but alive. "Toryn! The eastern spire! Fallback point has changed! Head toward the old comms tower! I'm already there, trying to—" The transmission cut out. Toryn's pulse slammed against his ribs. "Number no! Not now!" He spun, breaking into a run, dodging past flaming debris and the twisted bodies of neighbors, colleagues, people who'd been alive only minutes ago. Above, Voryn warships drifted through the smoke like executioners, their crystalline hulls refracting light into eerie spectrums. Each blast from their cannons left behind devastation that bled like open wounds across the colony's infrastructure. Toryn sprinted past the wreckage of a shuttle, its emergency lights still flickering. Too late. The evac vessels had already launched, and those left behind were nothing more than collateral. The tower came into view, a skeletal monolith against the burning skyline. He could see Toryn. At the edge of the platform, his husband worked feverishly at a data console, fingers flying over the laser plasma interface. "Toryn!" Toryn's voice was hoarse from smoke. Toryn turned, relief flashing across his soot-streaked face. "I'm overriding the encryption on the Planetary distress beacon. We can still get a message to—" A horrific shriek cut him off. Toryn saw them first. Voryn shock troopers, lanky, translucent-skinned creatures with jagged exoskeletal armor, emerged from the wreckage below. Their multi-jointed limbs moved too fast, their weapons thrumming as they took aim. Toryn didn't hesitate. He slammed his fist on the transmitter, sending the encoded signal into the void, before the tower's main support structure disintegrated in a white-hot explosion. Toryn could only watch, frozen in time, as his husband, his entire world, plunged into the abyss of collapsing steel. The impact reverberated through his bones. The locket, still warm, hit the ground at his feet. A hollow silence swallowed the colony, interrupted only by the crackling of distant fires. Then, a transmission descended upon them, broadcasted from the Voryn flagship hovering in low orbit. A face materialized on every functioning heads-up display, Silver Keth, Supreme Chancellor of the Voryn Ascendancy. His reptilian features were arranged into an expression of cold detachment, his amber eyes gleaming with something almost amused. Humanity was given a place among the stars. His voice resonated, smooth as polished steel. And yet, you remain an infestation, tainting the purity of the galactic order. Your species has proven unworthy of existence. This, he gestured to the burning world below, is the natural correction of an evolutionary mistake. The transmission flickered out. Toryn shook violently, rage drowning out the ache in his ribs, the burn of his wounds. His hands found the locket and clenched it so tightly the edges bit into his palm. His world was gone. His people were being erased from history. But not all of them. Toryn stumbled through the rubble, his movements fueled by something colder than survival. The main comms array was destroyed, but he knew of an older relay station beneath the observatory's ruins. If any part of it still functioned, he could reroute a signal, one last cry into the void. The Voryn troops hadn't reached this sector yet. He pried open a maintenance hatch, ignoring the sharp sting of torn flesh as he descended into the underground structure. The power grid flickered weakly, a dying heartbeat pulsing through the wiring. He forced himself to stay focused. He had minutes, at most. Sliding into the worn-out command chair, Torren bypassed the outdated security protocols. The system barely responded. Manual override. His fingers trembled as he input the emergency access codes, accessing one of the last active transmission bands. The relay sputtered. Its range wasn't strong enough. He needed a boost. His eyes darted to the emergency power reserves. If he rerouted everything to the signal, the entire bunker would overload. It didn't matter. He was already dead, whether now or when the Voryn found him. A flickering countdown appeared on the laser plasma interface. Torren took a slow breath, then keyed in the transmission. "This is Dr. Torren Draven of Vera 9. The Voryn Ascendancy has declared war on Earth. They are wiping us from existence. If anyone hears this..." His voice hitched, but he clenched his teeth and forced himself to finish. "They came for us. Earth, avenge us." He pressed send. The bunker's power failed immediately, plunging the chamber into darkness. Above, the ceiling shuddered as something massive landed nearby. The Voryn had found him. Earth. Jackson Holt stood on the observation deck of Fleet Command, watching the storm churn across the Atlantic. The glass panels shuddered as wind howled against the structure. Behind him, officers whispered in hushed tones. The transmission from Vera 9 had been received. Jackson clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into a fist. The Voryn weren't just skirmishing. This was extermination. Beside him, Bryn Salter, his second-in-command, watched the storm with an unreadable expression. "Orders, sir?" Jackson exhaled, his breath slow, measured. There was no question. "Prep the fleets. Full war doctrine." Silence filled the command center. Then, movement. Officers scrambled, voices overlapping, boots striking against the metal flooring as they rushed to obey. A young tactical officer hesitated before approaching Jackson. "Sir, there's something else." Jackson turned. The officer looked pale. "The archives flagged something," the officer continued, lowering his voice. "The distress signal. It activated an old subroutine, a classified project, something called Black Ships." The room went still. Jackson didn't blink. Instead, he turned back toward the window, watching the storm's surge roll across the dark waters. "Wake them up!" Outside, thunder growled, low, distant, hungry. Vex Torren stood at the helm of his command shuttle, watching Earth swell in the viewport. A dull, primitive orb of rock and water, barely worth the effort of conquest. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders against the weight of his ornate battle armor, a ceremonial burden rather than a necessity. The humans had resisted on the outer colonies, but this was a culling. "Mark this day well," he muttered to his officers, his voice smooth as glass. "History will record it as the moment the galaxy was cleansed of its last vermin." The ship shuddered as it punched through the upper atmosphere, turbulence rattling against the reinforced hull. Below, sprawling cities glowed dimly in the night, their pale lights flickering like embers in dying coals. The ground forces had already begun their descent, deploying in tight formations to overwhelm local resistance. Voryn drop pods streaked across the sky, carving luminous scars into the darkened clouds. The invasion had begun. Torren leaned forward, watching the first wave of shock troopers land in the open fields beyond the human settlements. Their exoskeletal armor gleamed under the burning sky, weapons primed, formations disciplined. Then something went wrong. The moment the first boots hit the ground, Voryn's soldiers crumpled. Their bodies twisted unnaturally, arms buckling under their own weight, chitinous plates grinding as they collapsed onto the dirt. Some thrashed, convulsing in confusion, their limbs refusing to obey. Others simply lay motionless, their breathing labored, gasping against the crushing force bearing down on them. Toran's eyes narrowed. "What is this?" His second-in-command, Kyrex Fowl, glanced at the battlefield feed, his mandibles clicking in alarm. "Gravitational density, 3 times that of Voryn Prime." He turned, his ridged brow furrowed. "They can't stand." Toran watched as a squad of human soldiers emerged from the tree line, moving with practiced efficiency. They raised their weapons, and the night was torn apart by the sharp, percussive snap of railguns. The Voryn troops, barely able to lift their own rifles, were torn apart like paper. A realization settled in Toran's gut. This wasn't a battle. This was a massacre. He clenched his fists, forcing down the creeping unease. "Tell the drop pods to adjust trajectory. Deploy further inland, denser population zones. Burn this world to the bedrock." Kyrex hesitated. "And the fallen?" Toran's gaze never wavered. "Leave them." Dren Varkus knelt in the underbrush, watching the aliens collapse like marionettes with their strings cut. The jungle canopy above was thick, veiling his squad in shifting shadows as they maneuvered through the dense undergrowth. Dren adjusted his grip on his rifle, his knuckles stiff from the humidity. Beside him, his squadmate Rand stifled a laugh. "They packed light for hell," Rand muttered. Dren allowed himself a sharp grin. "Not my problem if their bones aren't built for real gravity." The aliens were struggling, floundering in the mud like insects tipped on their backs. A few managed to rise, but their movements were sluggish, each step a visible strain. Dren exhaled, sighting down his barrel. "Let's help them lie back down." The first shot punched through the skull of a Voryn trooper, its brittle carapace splitting open like shattered glass. The others barely had time to react before the squad opened fire. Railgun rounds tore through the jungle, hissing through the thick air as they met their marks. Bodies crumpled, armor cracked. The sound of impact was dull and wet, drowned beneath the chaos. But something else moved in the foliage. Dren raised his hand, signaling a halt. His squad fell silent, pressing into the shadows. A few meters ahead, vines unfurled like waiting jaws, creeping toward the fallen Voryn. One soldier, still clinging to consciousness, tried to push himself up, his breathing ragged. The vines coiled around his limbs in an instant, tightening, dragging him into the underbrush. His scream choked off. A moment later, the jungle swallowed him whole. Dren let out a slow breath. Nature was doing their work for them. "You see that?" Rand whispered. "Yeah," Dren murmured. "Turns out Earth doesn't like guests." The comms crackled in his ear. "Varkus, report." Dren tapped his receiver. "Jackson, if you're listening, we've got him on the ropes." In high orbit, Jackson Holt stood before the central display of the war room. The laser plasma interface flickered, showing real-time updates of the battlefield below. His hands were clasped behind his back, his expression carved from stone. He had known Earth was a death world. Now the Voryn were learning it firsthand. Behind him, Bryn Salter crossed his arms. "They didn't expect to suffocate under their own weight, did they?" Jackson shook his head. "They expected a weak enemy." He turned, his gaze sharp. "They were wrong." Another officer stepped forward. "Sir, the black ships have reached position." A hush fell over the war room. Even Salter's usual stoicism cracked for a moment. "Already?" The officer nodded. "The Voryn still haven't detected them." Jackson exhaled through his nose. "Then we keep it that way." The black ships were ghosts in the dark, invisible to enemy scans, their stealth plating bending light itself. They drifted through the void, positioning themselves between the moon and the approaching Voryn fleet. A young lieutenant hesitated before speaking. "Sir, about the classified directive." Jackson turned sharply, cutting him off with a single glance. "Not a word." The lieutenant swallowed and fell silent. Salter studied him carefully. "Project Ember," he said, voice low. Jackson didn't answer. Instead, he looked back at the display, watching as the first Voryn cruisers entered the trap. "Hold position," he ordered. "Let them walk in." Salter watched him for a long moment, then nodded. "Aye, sir." Jackson pressed his knuckles against the edge of the display, eyes narrowed. The battle wasn't just turning, it was tilting, and soon it would collapse entirely. Torrin Draven moved like a phantom through the ruins of Vera 9. His breath came shallow, chest tight with exhaustion, but he forced himself forward. Every step sent a ripple of pain through his ribs, the half-sealed wound in his side throbbing like a second heartbeat. The colony was a carcass now, the air thick with the bitter residue of burned infrastructure and scorched flesh. He dropped behind a collapsed transport, peering through the tangled wreckage. A Voryn patrol stalked through the skeletal remains of the settlement. 4 figures, their gait unnaturally smooth, eyes sweeping in sharp, deliberate movements. Their chitinous armor shimmered under the cold glow of the burning skyline. Torrin steadied his breath. His pulse wasn't allowed to betray him now. The transmitter was still buried somewhere beneath the comms relay, and without it, his message would remain unheard. He moved again, slipping between fallen beams, glass crunching softly under his boots. Each movement was a gamble, every breath a risk. A hand clamped his shoulder. Torrin twisted, swinging an elbow, but the figure yanked him down before the movement connected. A human face stared back at him. Corin Gile. "You're alive," the young comms officer whispered. Relief flickered across his soot-streaked features. I thought I was the only one left." Torrin swallowed the bile rising in his throat. "Not yet." Gile nodded, glancing over his shoulder. "There's still a signal relay under the sublevel. It's barely holding power, but if we reroute through—" A distant shriek split the air. Both men went still. The Voryn had found something. Giles' jaw tensed. "We need to move, now." The sublevel stank of melted circuits and charred metal. The control panels were half destroyed, sparks skittering over the console as if it were still debating whether to die entirely. Gile moved fast, fingers flying over the laser plasma display, bypassing the security lockouts. Torrin gripped the back of the chair, forcing his body to remain upright. "We need full range. Anything short of that, the message doesn't leave the system." Giles' eyes flicked to him. "The capacitor won't hold if I push it that hard." Torrin didn't blink. "Then burn it out." The younger man exhaled sharply but didn't argue. He routed emergency power, overriding fail-safes. The room hummed as the relay groaned back to life, weak but functional. Torrin stepped forward, leaning over the mic. "This is Dr. Torrin Draven of Vera 9. If anyone is listening—" A distant crash interrupted him. Gile turned sharply. The Voryn were here. Torrin clenched his teeth. "If anyone is listening, Earth has been marked for extinction. We are being erased. If you receive this, spread the message. This is not just war. This is genocide." A plasma shot detonated the console next to Gile. He jerked back, swearing, reaching for his sidearm. Torrin spun as the first Voryn stormed through the doorway. Gile fired first, his pistol cutting through the darkness, punching into the soldier's chest. The Voryn staggered but didn't fall. Another shot, then another. The alien lunged, claws flashing. Gile shoved Torrin back, a plasma bolt ripped through him. He collapsed without a sound. Torrin froze, staring. The console was still active. The transmission was still broadcasting. Giles' hand twitched. Barely alive, eyes flickering, he met Torrin's gaze. "Finish it." Torrin forced himself forward, ignoring the sick weight in his stomach. He reached over Giles' body, fingers flying across the controls. The message had to go further, beyond Earth. He rerouted the frequency, amplifying the signal through dormant relays across the sector. It had to reach someone. A second plasma shot tore through the console. Torrin yanked the backup drive free and ran. Earth, Rylan Torm, skies above Europa. Rylan Torm was out of missiles and down to his last 2 railgun rounds. The battle above Europa had spiraled into chaos, a frantic dogfight between human squadrons and the Voryn fighter wings. The planetary defenses had already collapsed. If they lost air superiority here, Earth's outer defense perimeter was next. Rylan's fighter spun through the debris field, his ship's structural frame groaning under the pressure. He had no shields left, didn't need them. A Voryn interceptor streaked past his starboard wing. Too fast. He rolled hard, cutting low into the planetary atmosphere, the pull of gravity barely keeping his ship in one piece. His comms flared to life. It wasn't a squadron signal, it wasn't a command directive, it was a message. If anyone is listening, Earth has been marked for extinction. Rylan's hands clenched around the controls. The voice continued. We are being erased. This is not just war, this is genocide. A second later, his heads-up display flooded with an incoming reply. Not from Earth, not from any human colony. It was an open transmission from unknown coordinates. Rylan's breath caught. The shroud listens. Voryn flagship. Supreme Chancellor. Silver Keth. Silver Keth stood at the helm of his command vessel, eyes half-lidded as he observed the chaos below. The humans were resisting harder than anticipated. It didn't matter. They were not built for survival. His second-in-command approached cautiously. Sir, a transmission was intercepted. Origin, Vera 9, the human colony. Keth exhaled slowly, tilting his head. And their distress call spread further than expected. It reached other species. There have been responses. Keth's expression didn't change. Let them squirm, he murmured. The officer hesitated. One of the replies, he swallowed. It was different. Keth turned. The officer hesitated. Then, slowly, he brought up the data on the laser plasma display. One message, translated from a language that hadn't been recorded in any known archives. The shroud listens. For the first time, Silver Keth's smile faded. Part 4. The black tide rises. Jackson Holt stood at the command dais, eyes locked onto the tactical overlay. The black ships had already drifted into the battlefield, invisible phantoms lurking in the void. On the laser plasma display, Voryn ships clustered together in defensive formations, their captains unaware that death was whispering through the dark. Hold fire, Jackson murmured. His voice was measured, deliberate. Let them sink deeper. The Voryn fleet, massive and arrogant, moved forward in sweeping, synchronized maneuvers, unaware that the abyss had already coiled around them. Their officers relied on their advanced sensors, systems so refined, so absolute in their arrogance that they failed to detect the hunters hidden within the black. A junior officer whispered, "They're aligning for a full planetary bombardment." Jackson didn't respond. He waited, and then, with the flick of his hand, he gave the order. The black ships awoke. Kinetic lances ripped through the dark like silent guillotines. Armor split apart in surgical cuts, entire warships shattering into fragmented wreckage before they even realized they were under attack. Explosions bloomed in brilliant, soundless eruptions, debris cascading in fiery arcs as the Voryn fleet twisted in a panic, scrambling to find the enemy that did not exist on their sensors. One of the Voryn warships turned its cannons blindly into the void and fired. The beams vanished into nothingness. Screams filled the intercepted comms as entire command decks were vented into the black. Bryn Salter, Jackson's second-in-command, stood at his side, watching the slaughter unfold with cold detachment. Like drowning insects, he muttered. Jackson exhaled slowly. Like justice. Dren Varkis crouched beside the smoldering remains of a Voryn scout vehicle, adjusting the straps of the custom-rigged flamethrower unit mounted to his back. The jungle flickered with firelight. a breathing, restless inferno fueled by alien corpses and human defiance. The Voryn had learned the mistake of setting foot on Earth. Now, they would burn for it. His squad had already secured most of the forward encampments, but pockets of resistance still lingered, hiding behind their useless energy shields, as if they could somehow outlast Earth's wrath. Dren tapped his comm. "Ran! Status!" A burst of static, then, "We got another nest holed up near the ridge. They're digging in." Dren smirked. "Then let's smoke 'em out." He ignited the jetpack thrusters, launching himself over the battlefield. Below, the Voryn soldiers scrambled, eyes wide with something very close to fear. They had never faced a species that fought like this. Dren adjusted his trajectory, aimed the flamethrower, and let hell loose. Fire roared through the clearing, consuming everything in its path. Voryn bodies twisted, armor liquefying, voices raw with alien screams. Some tried to run. They didn't make it far. As he landed, Rand jogged up beside him, grinning. "You always did like making an entrance." Dren shrugged, flicking off the flame nozzles. "Nothing personal," he said, stepping over the blackened husks of the fallen. "I just hate uninvited guests." Torrin was still shaking when the rescue team dragged him from the rubble of Vara 9. He should have died. He should have been a pile of smoldering flesh beneath the wreckage of the comms relay. Instead, he was here, in a stolen Voryn transport, staring at the alien rifle in his lap. "You know how to use that thing?" Torrin turned. Dren was watching him, expression unreadable beneath the soot and battle grime. Torrin swallowed hard. "No." Dren leaned back against the bulkhead, smirking. "Good. Nothing worse than an overconfident amateur?" He reached over and tapped a button on the heads-up display, bringing up a schematic of the Voryn weapon. "I'll show you. You keep up or you get left behind." Torrin exhaled, gripping the rifle. He had been a scientist once, a man of reason. Now, he was something else. Milo Kor didn't speak much. He didn't need to. He preferred to let his hands do the talking, the rapid movement across the console, the rewiring of alien encryption, the quiet dismantling of security grids. He sat hunched over the Voryn command terminal, bypassing protocols with mechanical precision. He had already dug through their comms chatter, but something caught his attention, an encryption different from the others. Frowning, he leaned in, adjusting the decryption parameters. The message crackled through, distorted but clear enough. "The shroud knows." Milo's fingers stilled. He replayed the signal, analyzing the waveform. It wasn't Voryn, and it wasn't human. Milo turned to Jackson, his voice quiet but urgent. "Sir, we've got another player on the board." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Milo hesitated. "I don't know." But something did. Above the wreckage of the Voryn fleet, Ryland Torm's squadron cut through the void, leaving behind a signature of their victory. His railguns seared through the surface of a Voryn moon, carving a human glyph deep into the rock, a scar that would last for millennia. A message, a warning. Humanity was here, and they were never leaving. Far beyond the conflict, in the depths of an uncharted nebula, something stirred. It had been waiting, watching. It had heard the signal, and now it was listening. Jackson Holt stood at the edge of the war room, fingers steepled as he watched the laser plasma display. The Voryn fleets were closing in, their formations tightening, preparing for a final offensive. Outside, Earth's orbital defenses were already engaged. Kinetic railgun platforms launching devastating payloads that carved through enemy warships like rusted tin. But brute force wouldn't win this war. It never had. War belonged to the ones who thought ahead. Bryn Salter leaned against the console beside him. "They're committing everything. Their last fleets, their ground forces. The whole damn ascendancy is pushing forward." Jackson's gaze didn't shift. "They think they're pressing an advantage." Salter exhaled through his nose. And we let them think that? Jackson nodded. We let them think that. His hand moved to the control panel, fingers hovering over a sequence locked behind multiple security clearances. A classified directive, Project Ember. His voice was quiet but sharp. Execute deployment. A single button press. A choice that would shatter worlds. Across the Voryn-occupied colonies, the planet itself revolted. Deep below the crust, seismic detonators activated in unison, unleashing a chain reaction of tectonic devastation. Cracks splintered through the earth, swallowing entire battalions in yawning chasms. Cities collapsed inward, their structures folding into the fractures like broken bones. On the Voryn capital outpost of Koresh 4, commanders barked desperate orders as their command centers tilted at unnatural angles. Screens flickering with the same cold truth. The ground was no longer stable. Soldiers scrambled for ships that could no longer launch, their landing zones splitting apart beneath their feet. Entire divisions vanished into the shifting crust, their screams drowned in the deep, bone-rattling groan of planetary upheaval. The planet wasn't just being bombed, it was rejecting them. And in the aftermath, silence. Voryn transmission lines flickered with nothing but dead static. On board the Voryn flagship, Supreme Chancellor Silvar Keth watched the footage in stunned silence. His claws tightened against the control panel. The reports were impossible. The humans. They had moved the very bones of the planets. A tactician, his voice trembling, turned to him. Supreme Chancellor, we need to regroup. We've lost entire battalions. Their strategy is beyond conventional warfare. Keth turned slowly, his gaze settling on the officer with quiet menace. You think this is strategy? His voice was like ice cracking underfoot. This is desperation disguised as strength. The tactician hesitated. Sir, Keth slammed a clawed hand onto the panel, silencing him. Burn Earth to the core. Milo Core had spent the last hour dissecting intercepted Voryn transmissions, searching for patterns in their encryption signatures. He had expected chaos. What he found was worse. The Voryn weren't just dealing with a war, they were dealing with revolts. His fingers flew across the interface, breaking through fragmented enemy transmissions, deciphering panicked reports from distant sectors. Slaves had risen up. Entire systems, once crushed under Voryn dominion, were now ablaze with rebellion. And it all traced back to one message. The transmission from Vera 9. Torrin's voice, carrying across the void. A call that had become a spark. Milo turned to Jackson, his voice calm but edged with something grim. The Empire is collapsing. We didn't just start a war, Commander. Jackson met his gaze. We started a revolution. Torrin sat on the edge of a makeshift barracks, the alien rifle in his lap feeling less foreign in his hands than it had hours ago. Dren Varkas dropped onto the bench beside him, shaking ash and sweat from his face. Hell of a mess you started, Doc. Torrin looked at the rifle, then at the distant sky, where the war still burned in the heavens. Wasn't supposed to be a war, he muttered. Dren laughed, low and bitter. That's what every war starts as. The comms crackled. Jackson's voice. Move into position. We draw them in. They think they're hunting us. We let them believe that. Torrin stood, rolling his shoulders. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a soldier. The Voryn fleet descended upon Earth, their warships blotting out the sky. Columns of enemy infantry surged forward, their weapons scorching the ground, turning human defenses into craters of molten debris. And then, the trap snapped shut. From the wreckage of previous battles, captured Voryn ships roared to life. Torrin, Dren, and a strike team of former prisoners and hardened human soldiers launched a coordinated assault, using stolen Voryn tech against its creators. Dren led the ground assault, cutting through enemy forces with a brutality that felt more like revenge than strategy. Torren, now moving like a man born to this fight, delivered clean, methodical shots, every round finding its mark. And overhead, the black ships unleashed their final, calculated devastation. The Voryn fleet fractured. What had started as a galactic empire now bled like a dying animal. Bryn Salter found Jackson standing in the wreckage of a command post, watching the horizon, where the last remnants of the enemy were falling back. For the first time, Jackson looked old. Salter approached quietly. "We did it." Jackson exhaled. Slow. Not yet. He reached into his jacket, pulling free a worn set of dog tags, his son's. He turned them over in his palm, silent for a long moment. Then he clenched them in his fist. "Not yet," he repeated. The battlefield lay in ruins, but the Voryn were in retreat. Silver Keth had lost. But Earth's greatest war wasn't over, because in the silence after the battle, a final transmission came through. A voice. Not human, not Voryn. It whispered through intercepted signals, threading through abandoned comms like a breath through a graveyard. "The shroud is awake." Jackson looked up at the stars, his jaw tightening. The message arrived in clipped, urgent tones. A ceasefire request. Jackson Holt leaned against the war table, expression unreadable as the transmission crackled across the bridge. Silver Keth's voice came through the laser plasma display, stripped of its usual arrogance. "This war has no victors," Keth declared, his tone calculated, not defeated. "It is time for diplomacy." Jackson tilted his head slightly, glancing at Bryn Salter. His second-in-command had his arms crossed, watching the display with open skepticism. Salter exhaled. "He knows he's lost." Jackson turned back to the transmission. "Patch me through." A brief static shift, then, "We accept the parley," Jackson said, his voice even. "But hear me, Keth, this isn't peace. It's your funeral rites." Torren Draven adjusted the Voryn armor he wore over his battle gear, the weight unfamiliar but no longer unwelcome. He had seen too much, lost too much, to feel anything resembling hesitation. Dren Varkas holstered his sidearm, shooting him a look. "They expect us to crawl," he muttered. "That's going to be awkward when we break their damn legs instead." The team stepped into the docking bay of the Voryn flagship, the alien vessel unsettlingly silent as they made their way to the war chamber. The corridors were pristine, untouched by the chaos that had consumed the fleet outside. It was an illusion of control. The doors hissed open. Inside, Silver Keth sat at the High Council table, flanked by his surviving officers. His golden exoskeletal armor gleamed, his sharp reptilian gaze betraying no hint of desperation. He thinks this is a game, Torren realized. He still thinks he has an out. Jackson strode forward, his boots striking against the polished flooring with deliberate weight. He didn't sit. He didn't bow. He only stared. Keth's mandibles twitched. "You should be honored, Commander Holt. No human has ever—" Jackson raised a hand, cutting him off. "Enough." Keth hesitated. Jackson leaned forward, voice like a slow-moving avalanche. "You're not here because you want peace. You're here because you're bleeding out." The war chamber turned still. Keth's fingers tapped against the table's surface, slow, controlled. "You have fought well, but we can end this without further bloodshed." Torren stepped forward, a small device in his hand. He placed it on the table and activated it. A data stream filled the chamber, intercepted Voryn transmissions unraveling in real time. The messages echoed like death knells. "Riots in the core worlds. The enslaved systems have revolted. The chain of command is fracturing. Entire fleets defecting. Central authority compromised. The ascendancy is collapsing. We cannot hold the outer rim." Keth's mandibles tightened as he absorbed the reality of it. Torren's voice was quiet. "You're not losing to us, Keth. You're losing to the entire galaxy." Keth's officers exchanged uneasy glances. Jackson exhaled slowly, voice sharp as a blade. "So here's how this works." He leaned in. You take what's left of your fleet. You leave. You never return. Keth's claws tensed against the armrest. Jackson straightened. Or we end you. Right here, right now. Keth was silent for too long. Then finally he exhaled through his mandibles, his hands lifting from the table in mock surrender. Very well, he murmured. We will withdraw. A long beat. Then, Keth's clawed fingers tapped twice against the console embedded in the table. A signal. The war chamber's walls retracted, revealing hidden weapons embedded in the structure. Red targeting reticles snapped onto the boarding party. Dren cursed. I knew this bastard had no spine. Torren reached for his rifle. Before anyone could fire, the ship shook violently, the deck buckling beneath their feet. A massive explosion tore through the flagship's upper decks, ripping open the bridge with a fireball that howled through the corridors. Keth's officers were flung from their seats, screams cut short as flames engulfed the chamber. Jackson's comm flared with a single transmission. See you on the other side. Rylan. Outside the burning flagship, Rylan Torm's fighter cut through the wreckage like a comet, leaving a smoking, crumbling bridge in its wake. His voice, steady as ever, came through the comm one last time. Make it count. Then his ship vanished into the fire. The flagship convulsed under the impact, alarms wailing. The remaining Voryn officers scrambled, their chain of command shattered. Keth was gone. Riots in the core worlds. The enslaved systems have revolted. The chain of command is fracturing. Entire fleets defecting. Central authority compromised. The ascendancy is collapsing. We cannot hold the outer rim. Keth's mandibles tightened as he absorbed the reality of it. Torren's voice was quiet. You're not losing to us, Keth. You're losing to the entire galaxy. Keth's officers exchanged uneasy glances. Jackson exhaled slowly, voice sharp as a blade. So here's how this works. He leaned in. You take what's left of your fleet. You leave. You never return. Keth's claws tensed against the armrest. Jackson straightened. Or we end you. Right here, right now. Keth was silent for too long. Then finally he exhaled through his mandibles, his hands lifting from the table in mock surrender. Very well, he murmured. We will withdraw. A long beat. Then, Keth's clawed fingers tapped twice against the console embedded in the table. A signal. The war chamber's walls retracted, revealing hidden weapons embedded in the structure. Red targeting reticles snapped onto the boarding party. Dren cursed. I knew this bastard had no spine. Torren reached for his rifle. Before anyone could fire, the ship shook violently, the deck buckling beneath their feet. A massive explosion tore through the flagship's upper decks, ripping open the bridge with a fireball that howled through the corridors. Keth's officers were flung from their seats, screams cut short as flames engulfed the chamber. Jackson's comm flared with a single transmission. See you on the other side. Rylan. Outside the burning flagship, Rylan Torm's fighter cut through the wreckage like a comet, leaving a smoking, crumbling bridge in its wake. His voice, steady as ever, came through the comm one last time. Make it count. Then his ship vanished into the fire. The flagship convulsed under the impact, alarms wailing. The remaining Voryn officers scrambled, their chain of command shattered. Keth was gone. Jackson grabbed Torren by the shoulder. We need to move. The team pushed through the collapsing corridors, fire licking at their heels. The boarding shuttle's doors slammed shut behind them as they launched off the dying flagship. As the ship pulled away, Torren caught sight of a secondary escape craft launching from the wreckage. Keth, alive, running, vowing revenge. Back on Earth, the war was won. The Voryn were shattered, their fleets retreating into the dark, no longer conquerors, only fugitives. Jackson Holt stood at the helm of Earth's war room, his hands pressed against the cold steel of the command console. The battle had ended, but the war was far from over. Voryn fleets limped back to the remnants of their empire, scattered and leaderless, but not eradicated. Silver Keth had escaped, and the intercepted message, "The Shroud is awake," cast a longer shadow over their victory than any retreating warships ever could. He turned his gaze toward Milo Kor, who was still hunched over the decryption station, his fingers moving in rapid, controlled precision. The intercepted data was unlike anything they had seen before, older, layered in cryptic sequences that didn't match known Voryn encryption. Bryn Salter leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed. "Whatever's out there, it's got Keth scared. And after what we just did to them, that says something." Milo exhaled, his brow furrowed. "This isn't just a transmission. It's a warning. The Shroud didn't just hear our war, it was listening before it even started." Torrin Draven stepped forward, his grip on his stolen Voryn rifle tightening. "We can't afford to let Keth regroup. If there's something worse coming, we need to be the ones holding the knife when it arrives." Jackson nodded. This wasn't about waiting for the next war to come knocking. They had already seen what happened when humanity underestimated the galaxy's cruelty. It wouldn't happen again. They gathered in the tactical operations chamber, the dim glow of laser plasma displays casting long shadows over the room. The surviving fleet commanders, Dren Varkas, and intelligence officers formed a tight circle, the weight of what came next pressing against them all. Jackson tapped the console, bringing up a sector-wide analysis of Voryn-controlled space. "We're in a unique position," he began, his voice even. "Keth's empire is fractured, his fleets are in retreat, and his vassals are revolting faster than he can contain them." He shifted the display, showing tactical overlays of known strongholds. "If we move now, we don't just end a war. We make sure they never start another one." Dren's expression hardened. "We chase them down before they have a chance to breathe. Fine by me." Torrin studied the data, his mind already working through the details. They couldn't just send the fleet in blindly. "We'll need to divide them further, push them into splintering instead of reforming, take out their remaining leadership, force the smaller factions into infighting." Milo nodded, pulling up intercepted communications. "We can make them think their own people are betraying them. Misinformation, intercepted battle orders, false reports of mutiny. The Voryn rely on strict hierarchy. If we break that, they collapse from the inside." Bryn's gaze flicked toward Jackson. "And if that doesn't work?" Jackson's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then we burn what's left." He gestured toward a section of space marked in red, a final fallback position for the Voryn remnants. It was a sector at the edge of their known territory, bordering an uncharted expanse of black, where no records of exploration existed. Salter frowned. "And what's out there?" Milo hesitated before responding. "That's where the Shroud transmission originated." The silence that followed was heavy. Jackson straightened, locking eyes with his officers. "We don't leave unfinished wars. We end them, permanently." The strike teams moved into position with calculated precision, each task force assigned to disrupt critical Voryn assets. The goal wasn't just eliminating enemy forces, it was breaking their command structure beyond repair. Torrin led infiltration teams into abandoned Voryn outposts, planting false data to manufacture betrayals between Voryn warlords. Dren's Marines launched hit-and-run assaults, striking key supply chains before disappearing into the debris fields. Milo fed their fleet disinformation, rerouting Voryn reinforcements into empty star systems where they found nothing but silence and their own paranoia. The cracks began to widen. Within days, entire Voryn battalions turned on each other. Commanders executed their own officers under the belief they had been compromised. And then, when the infighting reached its breaking point, Earth's fleet descended. The black ships struck first. They came like ghosts, silent and unseen, slipping past failing defense lines and unleashing devastation in the form of high-velocity kinetic strikes. The planetary shields buckled, Orbital stations collapsed under their own debris, and once mighty warships were left drifting in shattered silence. The ground forces met a different fate. Toryn led coordinated sabotage runs, using Voryn weapons against them, rigging their own energy grids to overload, turning entire cities into firestorms of cascading failures. Dren's teams eliminated the remaining planetary command centers, no mercy, no hesitation. And then, it was done. The last of the Voryn warlords fell. Their empire, once spanning dozens of systems built on a foundation of cruelty, was now nothing but scattered wreckage. Jackson stood before the galaxy, the image of Earth's fleet displayed across every known communication channel. The war was over, but the message had to be clear. He leaned forward, voice even, unreadable. "We're not prey. We're the storm." The broadcast cut. Across the galaxy, species who had once cowered under Voryn rule looked toward Earth not as survivors, but as something greater. A reckoning. Toryn walked among the ruins of the last Voryn capital. The silence was heavier than he expected. No more resistance, no more fighting, just the wreckage of a fallen empire. Dren approached, kicking a shattered Voryn insignia aside. "So what now?" Toryn exhaled, looking toward the horizon. "Now we find out what's next." Milo's voice crackled through their comms. "Jackson, we have another intercepted transmission, not Voryn." The war room fell silent. Milo hesitated before playing the recording. The whisper returned. "The shroud is awake." Jackson stared at the transmission, his fingers curling into fists. The war was over, the enemy crushed, the empire shattered. Yet standing in the heart of the war room, Jackson Holt knew this wasn't victory. It was only the beginning of something far worse. Milo Corps' decrypted transmission still flickered on the laser plasma display, its words sinking into the silence that had wrapped around the command center like an iron shroud. "The shroud is awake." No one spoke. Dren Varkas finally broke the tension, his voice quieter than usual. "We just burned an empire to the ground. Now you're telling me something worse was watching?" Milo's fingers moved across the controls. The transmission had no clear origin, no coordinates, no known markers of civilization, just a pulse, like a heartbeat from something buried deep in the dark. Toryn Draven exhaled, his hands resting against the edge of the table. His voice carried a weight that none of them could shake. "Keth ran because he wasn't afraid of us. He was afraid of what was coming next." Jackson clenched his jaw. It made sense. The Voryn had never been subtle in their cruelty. They crushed entire species under their rule, bent the galaxy to their will without hesitation. Yet, when it became clear Earth would not kneel, Keth had still kept one foot out the door. Not to retreat, to escape. Silver Keth knew what was coming. Jackson turned to Milo. "Give me something. Anything." Milo didn't look up from the display. The transmission wasn't meant for us. It was meant for the Voryn, a warning or a reminder. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. "It's not just a signal. It's old, older than the Ascendancy, maybe older than any empire we've encountered." Bryn Salter finally spoke, his voice sharp as a blade. "Then why the hell did they respond to us?" A silence stretched between them. Then Toryn whispered, "Because we proved something." Jackson met his gaze, understanding clicking into place. The Voryn had believed themselves untouchable for centuries. They had conquered, dominated, erased civilizations as if they were footnotes in history. And yet, in the span of months, they had been undone, not by an empire, not by an ancient power, but by a species they had considered beneath them. Humanity had done something the galaxy hadn't seen before. It had made the gods take notice. Jackson inhaled deeply, his voice quieter but no less commanding. "If the Voryn feared the shroud, it means they've seen them before. And they survived." He looked to Milo. "Find me everything they had on them. Milo nodded, already moving. Dren's fingers tapped against the side of his rifle. So what now? We just sit and wait for whatever cosmic horror sent that message to come knocking. Jackson's gaze flicked back to the transmission, the words still lingering on the screen like a whisper in the dark. The war changed things, he murmured. Not just for us, not just for the Voryn, for everything watching from the shadows. Torrin crossed his arms. Then we need to be ready. Jackson's lips curled slightly, but there was no humor in his expression. We've been ready since the day they came for us. Days passed in silence, the fleet remaining on high alert as intelligence teams sifted through what little data had been pulled from the remains of the Voryn war records. Then, finally, Milo found it. He called the team into the war room, his expression paler than they had ever seen it. "There's something you need to see," he said, bringing up a hazy ancient star map, overlaid with coordinates that no longer existed. Entire sectors marked as voids, erased from Voryn records with only a single chilling descriptor: Shroud Dominion. Jackson's brow furrowed. How long ago? Milo hesitated. Before the Voryn, before even the earliest recorded interstellar empires. He exhaled. Whatever they aren't new. Salter ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. And yet, they've been quiet. Until now. Torrin studied the map, his fingers tightening against his palm. Because something woke them up. Milo's gaze flicked toward him. Us. A heavy silence fell over the war room. Dren scoffed, shaking his head. Let me get this straight. We kicked an empire's teeth in, and now some long-dead monster civilization finally decides to get out of bed? Sounds convenient. Milo didn't look convinced. Maybe. Or maybe we just reminded them why they stayed quiet in the first place. Jackson turned back to the map. It showed nothing. No planets, no life, just empty space where civilization should have been. There were no ruins, no survivors, no echoes of a war. Only silence. The shroud didn't conquer. They erased. Jackson exhaled, stepping back from the console. His voice was steady. So we make them remember who we are. The room went still. Milo frowned. You're talking about picking a fight with something we don't understand. Jackson's gaze didn't waver. I'm talking about making sure they understand us. The war had proven one undeniable truth. Humanity wasn't like the others. It didn't bend, it didn't break, it didn't scatter when threatened. If the Shroud wanted to see what had changed in the galaxy, then Jackson would show them. Salter sighed, rolling his shoulders. Hell, I was getting bored anyway. Torrin nodded once, no hesitation in his stance. Dren grinned, tilting his rifle over his shoulder. Fine, let's introduce ourselves. Jackson looked at his team, at the survivors who had stood against an empire and torn it down to ash and memory. This wasn't a fight for survival anymore. It was something bigger. Jackson turned back toward the war table, a new set of battle plans already forming in his mind. If the Shroud was awake, then so was humanity, and they weren't going anywhere. The display flickered with the last remnants of the intercepted message, the alien words still echoing like a prophecy left unanswered. Jackson reached forward, fingers pressing down on the console, clearing the display. His voice carried through the silence, a declaration, a promise, a war cry. Let them come.